Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Radio Society of Harrow. This afternoon we welcome Mark Lemon from the Bentley Priory team, and he's going to be talking about D-Day, and in particular the electronics and navigational aids, etc., around that amazing story. So over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you today for coming along today. I'm part of the Bentley Priory team, but really I'm here because of research that I've done, personal research into my father-in-law, Joseph Pemberton Jepson Bowie. And as I joked at Bentley Priory, it's great when you have somebody with such a rare name to try and dig out their information on all the systems. So Joe was involved every step of the way in the preparations for D-Day and beyond. What I'd like to do today, the structure of the talk, I'll start off talking about his training. I'll talk about his time in 140 Squadron, which is of particular interest to yourselves because that's where he developed some of these navigational aids, which I'll come on to. And he then moved to 41 Operational Training Unit, which was a new unit set up for training in reconnaissance specifically for D-Day. And then we'll finish off with his time at 268 Squadron, which was about 3 or 4 months prior to D-Day, going right the way through the Battle of Normandy and beyond. So he was involved right the way through. He actually hardly ever spoke of his time in the RAF. I met my wife Hilary, and about 2 months later, Joe was down in London, and for a couple of hours one rainy afternoon, he chatted about his time. I mentioned this to Hilary later. She'd gone off with her mum somewhere, and she was absolutely staggered. She said he has never ever spoken about it before. So rather stupidly, I didn't take any notes because I thought it was something he chatted about. So we were going away that Christmas together, and very, very sadly, Joe had a heart attack before then, so I never got time to speak to him. So a lot of the information on this talk actually comes from public records, as well as the bits that he did mention. But also, I have to give a great deal of thanks to a guy called Colin Ford, who wrote the squadron history for 268. And as we go through, you'll see a lot of actual photographs, photo reconnaissance pictures that were taken by 268 Squadron. We'll never know if they were specifically taken by Joe. Some of them may have been, some of them would have been his colleagues, but they would have all been exactly the type of thing that he was involved with right the way through. So this really is a bit of a reciprocal talk in thanks for you coming and giving us support on our Battle of Britain Day, which I believe you've done for several years now. And so really, I thought I'd come along today and give this talk. Equally, I'm a little bit on the sponge from you lot because you might well have more information when we come on to the technical parts. You'll understand it more. And at that stage, we're going to show you, there's a short video about what the specific thing he was involved with, the Rebecca Eureka system, a contemporary video of how it is deployed. And also, by sheer luck, in the last few months, somebody has actually uploaded a video which will be much more of interest to yourselves, I think, as well, on a strip down of one of these units, describing exactly how they actually worked at an electronics sort of level. Okay? So without further ado, onwards and upwards, as one might say. So, November 1940, and it was the first bit of the Blitz in Liverpool. Joe was just 18. He lived up on Wallasey, which is just over the ferry across the Mersey, as one might say, from Liverpool. And he decided to go up to the RAF recruitment centre, where he drew himself up to his full 5'4", shoved out his 31-inch chest, and went to see the recruitment officer. He was seen as a serious candidate. What they were really doing at that stage was whittling out, no-hopers. He was seen as an intelligent guy. He underwent extensive physical, mental stress tests when he was sent down to Padgate. So he went for his quick test and then they referred him to Padgate. So just into the new year, he went to one of the receiving centres at Padgate, where he had all sorts of examinations, physical, mental ability, and he was selected for training as a pilot/observer, and that's really important to remember. So he was both training for pilot and observer. Some people only were selected for one or the other. He would have sworn his oath of allegiance, as everybody did then, and he was given a little silver VR badge, which I should have pointed out on the previous screen, but that meant he was in the voluntary reserve. You didn't just go into the RAF, go along to the recruitment centre, and the next day you tootled off to the RAF, okay? Because that might have happened in the army, but in the RAF you had to await a training slot. They were massively trying to build up their training facility at this time and to get it increase the manning. So he actually waited several months, many months, before he went in and started his training. And during that stage, so that everyone wasn't going down the road saying, oh, what's that guy doing? Why isn't he doing something? Why hasn't he got a proper job? Why hasn't he joined up? You were given this VR badge, which meant, actually, yes, I have joined the RAF. I'm just waiting for my training spot. So, June 41 comes and he finally gets accepted in. He was kitted out down in Torquay and went for his 10 weeks basic training, as did everybody. So there, he would have learned about the RAF, he would have learned about the ranks, he would have learned about the discipline, all that sort of side. And finally, in August, he took his first flight in a Tiger Moth. The Tiger Moth, up here on the left, really looks like a First World War aeroplane. Now, they weren't as unsophisticated, actually, as they look. This was specifically good for training. Very, very forgiving. It doesn't go at great speed. It takes an awful lot to screw it up. It takes quite a lot of mishandling to fall out the sky. I'm not saying that you couldn't manage it if you practiced, but it was a difficult plane to go wrong. It had a low stall speed, etc. You would know before it stalled. Later planes, literally you'd be going along and bang, it would hit a stall speed. So great as a trainer. He then moved on immediately to the more powerful Harvard, which was the aircraft much more powerful now. You're up to about 250, 300 horsepower. In fact, the later ones were nearly 500 horsepower. This did about 180 miles an hour. So this was going at about the same speed as a bomber would have done. And they were obviously just a normal configuration, just the two wings, a normal monoplane, and much larger engine, much more torque reaction. So it was much more like flying a proper plane. And in fact, everyone who flew, well, virtually everyone who flew Spitfires or Hurricanes during the war, the vast majority, not every single one, would have trained on the Harvard. That was the main thing that you trained on. You then moved on, and a piece of kit which actually I was just discussing with some of your guys a second ago after the RAF Halton site shut, is the Link trainer. This was the very, very first, effectively, it was a on the ground training piece of kit. You could be covered in that cockpit, do your instrument flying, etc., etc., as if you're in fog or as if you're in daytime. And there was this little cord which wiggled around, and you were told to follow directions which would have taken you around a circuit on the map. And when you finished, they would show you on the map what you were supposed to be doing, and you'd see what you actually did do. This was an amazing piece of kit. This saved hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lives. It was invented by a guy in the States, and it meant that all your initial training could be done with no risk of falling out the sky when you were looking at navigation and all those sorts of things. So, finally, by the end of November, he'd reached the essential 100 hours of solo flight. He'd have flown a lot more than that, because he'd have done a lot of joint flying at first, especially in the two aircraft. And at that stage, he was ready to progress to his advanced twin engine training. and that was in Penhold in Alberta. Sorry, I need to go back one. Sorry, I've hopped one. And that's where so many of the pilots went. Canada's actual donation, you might say, to the war effort at this stage was to provide training facilities. They said, we don't have enough pilots, we can't help you out directly in the RAF, etc. But what we can do is we can start to provide training facilities. It was probably a commitment that they regretted later on, because it ended up being, I think it's not far short of 80,000 people were involved in the training facilities out in Canada. It became massive. So Joe took his ship from Liverpool, went over to Halifax, Nova Scotia, was met effectively by women in the WI who gave them apples and what have you. And you've got to remember, he'd just come out of wartime Britain and he went to Canada, and it must have been absolutely amazing. You know, everything was there. You could go and get cigarettes, you could get anything, nothing was on ration, etc. Then he took the 3-day train to the centre of Canada. Now, Alberta and the training facilities were excellent in two respects. They were near the prairies. So when you started off your training in a twin engine aircraft, it was nice and safe. You could go across the prairies, you're not going to run into much. However, they do have a massive variation of weather there, which is why you go and train. You want to be trained for flying in ice, for flying in fog, for flying in, you know, every single weather condition. And one of the good things, a bit like Britain, every day in Canada tends to be different on the weather. When you got better as well, of course, behind the prairies are the mountains, so you can go and do all sorts of different type of training back there. More dangerous, so as you progressed, you would have done that, and obviously navigation side of it was excellent. So he did 12 weeks on twin engine aircraft, and these are the Airspeed Oxfords that he would have flown. This is exactly them. They were actually a relatively modern aircraft. I think they were only designed in 35, 36, or I can't remember, designed or deployed into the RAF. However, when the ME-109 came along with the Germans, rather unsportingly, they could just shoot them straight out the sky. So they were very little deployment. Then they got put on night fighters, and then they realised they weren't even any use as night fighters. So these particular aeroplanes were taken over to Canada and used for training, and they were great as twin engine trainers. Again, I was thinking of calling this talk Grace of God, because thereby went I, and so many of Joe's colleagues died in training accidents, basically, as well as everything else. And the day before he arrived on base in Canada, 2 guys went missing. And just like nowadays, you know, you often hear in the news nowadays, especially in Canada, of prairie fires and smoke and fog, smoke coming over. 2 guys have got lost in prairie fire. They screwed up on their navigation, basically. And the penalty for screwing up on their navigation is they crashed into forest about 30 miles short of the runway. So not a very forgiving environment. When he finished all that, he got his wings, and then you come over into the operational training unit. So by now it's a year later. So he's done all his training. He's been out to Canada. He's done all that training. He's trained as a pilot and he's trained as a navigator. So 12 weeks on a pilot, 12 weeks as a navigator, because on those twin engine, you had both. You had to be able to do both jobs. So if the pilot got shot, killed, you had to be able to take over, and vice versa. So if the navigator got shot, the pilot had to take over. And that's important in the story a little bit later on. So now we're in what we call the operational training units. And this is where the pilot's raw skills were honed, okay? They did all sorts of training. They would have done, when they're in the bombers like this, they would have trained at low-level bombing, medium-level bombing, high-level bombing. But as well as all that sort of obvious stuff, they did a lot of particularly dangerous training because you had to give the pilots the skills and the confidence to do things. So they would have practiced formation flying. That's difficult enough. But they also had to practice how to drop out of formation. So if you're in a formation that's basically 3 deep and you're in the jam in the middle of the sandwich and you've just had an engine blown out and you need to get out of it, how do you get out of it without bashing the guy who's below you or to the right or to the left without killing all those? So there's all that sort of thing. You had to be able to practice glide landings. You had to be able to practice, as you take off, literally you go down the runway and then you would switch off one engine. So you'd have to make sure that you could immediately compensate so you didn't swerve round and crash, and so that you could get off the ground, because there's hedges and what have you at the end of the runway, which there were. And again, couple of fatalities whilst Joe was doing this, literally people that he was out flying with. They were doing combat training, so avoid and evade manoeuvres. So they would go up and they'd have a local bunch of guys who are practicing in their single engine Spitfires or Hurricanes, practicing attacking bombers, and they'd be the ones on the receiving end. And on one of those, one of them swerved to get out the way, collided with the guy next door, basically. So they both fell out the sky. Another one, when he was coming in, he was doing a glide landing, and which means that you've got your engine off, basically, pretending that you're going to come in with no engine. Came in too steeply, flipped over, and burst into flames. He survived, but obviously with massive injuries. So they pushed them to the limit, basically, and you had to push them to the limit so that when the big day came, you knew what to do. So people get it in their mind from the some of the things that you see in Battle of Britain and what have you about, oh, these guys have only had 10 days training when we stuck them out on the Battle of Britain. Not true. They might have only had 10 hours on a Spitfire or a Hurricane. They would all have done all that basic training. And by now, as you can see, Joe has done an awful lot of training. He's done 560 hours solo training. That's without all the other stuff, without all the stuff that he did on the Link trainer, etc. So he was now a really, really experienced pilot and navigator. July 1943. So when you think about it, this is 2 years after he started training, and he had that 5-month hanging around bit beforehand. So another thing that you always think about the RAF, you join up and you're off and running. No, 2 years he was training. So finally he was operational, fully operational. What does operational mean? Operational means that you are fighting the enemy either over this territory, fighting the enemy, or you are flying over enemy territory. So you're now off and running. The operational training units, there's a bit of a hint in their name, so this is the ones he was in before. The operational training units were training units. They could also be used for operations though. And one of the Blenheim units that Joe was in, not long beforehand, the Wellington units that he was in, not long beforehand had been deployed. So what would happen is the Wellingtons had gone over to Germany. There was some particular target that they had to get annihilated. They didn't succeed. They were sent back. You can't just turn a Wellington round in 5 minutes and the crew, just can't get back in and fly back over to Germany. So one of the Wellington's operational training units, they had then been deployed. It was something that was critical, and they knew that whatever the target was, it would be moved off site if they didn't just finish the job that day. So you could actually get sent abroad, even when you're training. You could have been sent over enemy territory. They were, and they lost about 4 aircraft, I believe, from the training unit that Joe went into. Again, grace of God, if it had been there a month earlier, would he have been deployed like that, So he joins 140 Squadron. This is part of the newly formed 2nd Tactical Air Force. Now, I'm not going to bore you stupid with stuff, but what happened was, by now, we're in 1943, and the risk of invasion has disappeared, okay, or pretty much disappeared. So what was Fighter Command was being wound down, and more or less by the end of 1943, Fighter Command didn't exist anymore, and that's what Jill and I do up at Bentley Priory, chat to people about Fighter Command. That was the centre of Fighter Command, but it was being substantially wound down. Montgomery had been made the chief of the Allied armies. So that was part of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, so SHAEF, and Montgomery was in charge of all the army side of the whole invasion plans for Normandy and Europe, okay? And he very quickly realised that you had to restructure the whole of the RAF support for that, okay? He realised that you couldn't have a siloed approach. You had to have reconnaissance fighters and bombers all under one command, so that if something goes wrong, you don't have to send a request to Bomber Command to get the bombers to come and do something that the reconnaissance guys have seen, and you don't have to call in additional fighter support for the bombers. He realised that was just not going to work, and he was dead right. And so this, the 2nd Tactical Air Force had only just been formed, and this was one of their very first squadrons. So they were taking in units, a lot of people from Fighter Command, and they also took in people from Bomber Command. Bomber Command did still carry on because they were still going over to Germany and bombing as a separate strategic thing. This is tactical, so this is talking about what needs to be done this week, next week, not what needs to be done in 6 months' time, okay? And so 140 Squadron was mainly operational reconnaissance, and it had Spitfires, and they were flying over what would be the invasion beaches, but they couldn't just fly over the invasion beaches because otherwise that would have been a bit of a giveaway. So they had to take 4 pictures outside of the invasion area for every one that they did inside. So they were going right the way down the coast of France, Belgium, what have you. So they had to do that to keep the the true invasion beaches secret, basically. And so they were mainly doing mapping. And it shows Joe, so the records showed Joe arriving and joining B Flight on the 11th of July. Now he joined with a bunch of other guys who were clearly very experienced, and some of them had DFCs, which is the highest award you can get. And that was it really. There was absolutely nothing mentioned about them. Everybody else being mentioned, apart from B Flight, nothing about them at all. He is mentioned undertaking a few local flights, and in fact the only time he ever flew a Spitfire was when somebody had just come back from somewhere, had some film on board, and it was so important to get it up to Medmenham that rather than rely on the motorcycle couriers, which they would normally have done, they said, right, we've got to get somebody that's got to get back up to Medmenham now. And Joe was the only one like standing there who hadn't just got back off operations, and so he flew the Spitfire up to Medmenham to get it immediately looked at. He's mentioned also doing an air liaison for Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, and digging ditches for a day, which was probably a punishment, either with all of B flights. So they'd possibly all gone out on the toot, got back late, and were all being punished, or somebody had made some massive great big cock up and nobody else would dob them in. But anyway, clearly the whole of B Flight were being punished for something and made to dig ditches. So he was there, was no doubt he was there. But what on earth was he doing? Nothing mentioned anywhere. And this is where it all comes down to what's going to really interest you. So like Joe's ditches, I needed to dig a bit deeper. And all of a sudden, I realised that what he'd been working on was literally at the time and for many, many years to come, top secret. Eureka! I found it, as one might say. Now then, what he was actually working on, and I sort of twigged this for a few comments on the squadron leaders reporting, the operational records book, and a couple of times the squadron leader said, I've been checking Eureka. And I thought, what the hell is this talking about? What is he talking about? And I then went and realised that Eureka, Rebecca, was a top secret transponder system that was working at the moment. Now, what this system actually did, and we'll see a video in a moment, is Eureka was a ground-based beacon, not even a beacon here. And the idea was that let's take the example of an SOE agent operating in France, and they've got a particular target, a chateau in the middle of nowhere that they want to destroy. We'll see a video about this. The beacon's put on the ground, and that sends out a signal, okay? The Rebecca unit is the unit up in the aircraft, and it's supposed to stand for the recognition of beacons, so it's called Rebecca. And that was sending out pulses to find the beacon and know where you were in relation to it. I'll come on to more details in a moment. And there were ever increasing levels of sophistication about this. The other reason why I realised it was that this is what it was all about was a couple of guys who visited the site were mentioned in the squadron records because they had to find them accommodation, and latterly I found that they were the two chief guys from the TRE, which is a technical research establishment that was overseeing this lot. And they did all sorts of testing. So it was used for SOE runs, it was used by the pathfinders. So when everyone, and I'm not taking anything away from the guys who flew the Mosquitoes, everyone thinks that they were genius navigators, and they were. They selected the very, very best navigators that they possibly could have for the pathfinders. But also, quite a number of times, they were helped by agents on the ground who had been dropped a beacon. So you could put a beacon literally on the edge of a factory complex or whatever, and then they would hone in on that for all the bombing. Well, the pathfinders also would send down the flares. And the other main reason why this was being developed in a reconnaissance area is that they're very keen to get nighttime photography. They just couldn't get it. It was getting too dangerous to go and do some of the photography deep into Germany during the day. They wanted to do it at night, but you had to know where you were. And so this helped to them to drop like a whacking great big flash bomb, and then you could see where you were. It illuminated the site and you took your photos of the intended targets, okay? And these were developed for the Battle of Normandy, as we'll see a little bit later. So these come back into the story because during the Battle of Normandy, and a lot of the training that you'll see in a second was because of this. Not only did you want to drop one beacon to find one site, to find one chateau to bomb it, you also wanted to have beacons deployed along the front line, and they had to work out how to do that. Normandy, they were in lorries, because then you knew exactly where your front line was, which was so fluid. So then if your bombers or your ground attack aircraft wanted to come over, they knew where to strike. Don't strike behind that. Anything in front of that is fair game. And that is why during the Battle of Normandy, we'll come on to it later, why they were so accurate and so able to bring down stuff right in front of our own troops normally. So they were looking at all sorts of test things. They were looking at, from your sort of perspective, what sort of power does a signal have to have? You don't want it too powerful because you don't want the Germans to be able to pick it up too quickly. Where should they be? When it started off, and you'll understand this better than I do, they wanted to have the aircrafts they ended up with like aerials sticking out of the front near right at the nose of the aircraft. You get two transponders like facing forward like that. They started off, all the early testing was to put them on the wingtips, because if you're going to try and triangulate something, obviously the farther away you are, the better. So they started off on the wingtips, but for some reason I don't technically understand, the variations in the engine speed meant that sent out something which distorted the signals. So then they realised that the distance they were picking up was being impacted by the engine speed, whereas if it was on the nose cone, it didn't. I don't understand technically why that was the case, but it was the case. So if you have a front line, how many beacons do you need? If let's say it's a straight line, do you need one at each end? Do you need one in the middle? How far do they have to be apart so that you can differentiate them? All that had to be worked out. All that was done by the guys, the technical guys and the navigators that, like my father-in-law. What's the best angle of approach? What's the best height, etc.? And records at Kew show this being tested on venturas and mosquitoes. And again, Joe did fly mosquitoes, but not, never in anger. But I believe he said he had flown mosquitoes, didn't fly many times. He said he only flew a couple of dozen times in mosquitoes. But this also would have been where he flew the mosquitoes, because that's when they were testing them for Pathfinder use. And so let's have a look at the Rebecca unit. So this is the unit which we will see in a moment. And we'll have a look at the video in a minute. This is the display that they would have seen. It could be adjusted to like short range and longer range. It varied over time. Like I say, it just constantly altered. At one stage, there was one that had 90 miles out, 30 miles out, and then 10 miles out. At this time, this unit has two ranges, 36 miles and 6 miles, so you could switch it as you got closer to the target. And what it does is, this is now about 25 miles out, that's 30 miles, that's 24 miles. So this little thingy here is showing you where you are. As long as that is in the middle, then you're aiming dead at it. If this ellipse here is over here, then you've got to move to port till it comes into the middle, okay? So it tells you your element of drift, get you exactly there. They were slung, the actual beacon was slung on somebody's leg. It was attached to a parachute. Quite a risk of breaking your leg, because the last thing you really want to do in a parachute is have something attached to you as you go down, in case anything goes wrong. They were put in wicker baskets. They were very heavy. They had massively heavy batteries, and all the time, one of the other big things that they were trying to do was to reduce the size of the battery, so to reduce the power consumption, get the battery interfaces more efficient. And they were also, just for fun, packed with explosives. So the internal of that thing was packed with explosives, and all the equipment on the aircraft was packed with explosives. And the guys were told, if you're going to come down and you think you're going to go down in enemy territory, you blow that up and blow yourselves up before you let it be captured. So testing. You can't really read this. This is about some trials that had taken place that month, about where the line should be, the angle of approach, the accuracy that can be expected for bombing near it. And they were also looking at improving the way that beacons could be coded to make sure they wanted to make sure that the coding that went to the beacon and came back, that there was no risk that there was anything else around that they might pick up accidentally. I'm not totally sure what they're talking about there, whether they mean, radio station could be blatting out music or whatever and it could interfere. I'm not quite sure, but there was obviously work being done along that line. And then this was showing the height that you need to be. So how successful were you in getting within so far of the beacon at various altitudes and various ranges? And this was all just used for never-endingly improving the systems. And this is a slightly later one that I found, which is 1944. So again, prior to D-Day, they're doing all this. And the big thing is that it was secret until the 1970s. So this was top secret all the way through. And this was looking at operational success. Again, different times of year, different types of equipment, and why they were getting that variation. You can see there's still quite a variation in success rates, which they were trying to improve, and all sorts of different ways. So this was monitoring what different equipment it had and whether it was improving it or not. So I also found some stuff which, again, I only hacked out because I thought you might be interested. This was some actual comments. Unfortunately, I can't really show them on screen because by the 1943 or so, most of the records in Kew, the paper they were using is almost like toilet paper. It's like ISIL. So you get typing on one side. If you take a picture of it, you can see all the type on the other side coming through. So it's just very, very difficult to read. Performance was very good, but ventilation issues in the pressurised cabins are causing overheating and frequency drift. This needs to be investigated and rectified. Again, me not being technical like you guys, don't really understand that. The next one is just saying that they needed spare Rebecca units. And then one about the strobe unit keeps stopping, and it's cured by adjusting an R16, but it could be an R56. Again, no idea. So all the work that was coming along. So what I'd like to, well, what we can do is, I've got a couple of videos, they take 13 minutes each, which will be a bit of a break, and then we'll have a coffee break. And this really just outlines what this Rebecca Eureka system is doing. I think it's interesting because most of the times, I imagine that people like you would be aware of stuff like oboe and all the other, the main systems that they were using for bringing in bombers. This is one that I've spoken to a lot of people about, a lot of people in Bentley Priory and at RAF Hendon and that, and the guys down at Brooklands, who look after the Wellingtons and the technology side down there. And the Rebecca Eureka is one that nobody's ever seems to have heard of. It actually, just for your info, it grew to become the system which is nowadays used for, you've used Rebecca Eureka, I bet you, dozens of times, each of you. If you've ever been in an aircraft and it hasn't run off the end of the runway and it's known where to land in fog, that's effectively Rebecca Eureka. So the Babs landing system was a direct development of Rebecca Eureka, where you just have effectively the Eureka beacon is the things that tell you where you are on the runway, and the Rebecca is up in your aircraft, in your jumbo jet. Okay, so I will now switch over and show the videos.
This maze of trees, streams, and rambling undergrowth rushing by below might easily hide an ammunition dump, an enemy stronghold, or for that matter, any form of strategic resistance. A bomber flying at high speed and low altitude scrambles the receding landscape into a confusing blur. Objectives blanketed by natural or man-made camouflage are virtually impossible targets for accurate low-level bombing. The Office of Strategic Services presents a plan whereby blind bombing of targets behind enemy lines can be carried out successfully. Where a ground agent with a beacon guides a plane to its hidden objective and in conformance with factors of speed, altitude, and target distance, signals the instant of release for precision bombing. These men with their equipment exemplify the type of teamwork that pays off in specialized warfare. Here's the lineup. An OSS ground agent operating in this general area has located an enemy objective approximately here. It could not be seen from the air, and he has relayed this intelligence back to the base. In order to pinpoint this objective for bombing, another OSS agent, either American or native to this locale, is dropped with a Eureka set into a small landing area near the target. For this specialized type of warfare, he has been schooled in strategy and cunning and has learned how to maneuver and exist in the toughest kinds of terrains, how to get into enemy areas, and how to get out. This agent will function as the land-based member of the Rebecca Eureka team. He will be met by the land-based agent who, acting as guide, will direct him to the target area. Within 1/2 mile of the objective, a spot is selected with suitable cover for setting up the Eureka beacon. From this location, he then determines the beacon target distance and bearing. That little box alongside of him is Eureka, a versatile radar beacon. Eureka will signal the proper approach azimuth and then guide the plane in on the bombing run. As the plane passes overhead or shortly thereafter, The Eureka operator signals for bombs away. If the plane does not fly directly overhead, it is off its course, and no release signal will be given. The Pathfinder plane can be any medium or attack bomber. The one chosen for this picture is an A-20G. The Rebecca operator and his equipment are located in the aft cockpit. Rebecca, with its indicator, transmitter and receiver unit, and control box, is a novel adaptation of radar which enables the plane to home accurately on a portable ground beacon. The operator, watching a pattern on the indicator or oscilloscope, informs the pilot of course changes and proximity to target. The precise instant to release the bombs is also registered on the oscilloscope, so the Rebecca operator releases the bombs. The pilot must be skilled in this special type of blind flying, making course corrections instantly and holding a true unswerving bearing on the target. He must also maintain the prearranged speed and altitude. Rebecca's range of transmission is approximately 15 miles, depending on the plane's altitude. When Rebecca contacts Eureka, the ground beacon is automatically activated or triggered and begins sending a beacon signal to the plane. The ground agent codes the plane's target approach azimuth, and the Rebecca operator, watching the oscilloscope pattern, talks the pilot on in. Until this contact is made, Eureka, although turned on, is not actually operating and therefore cannot be monitored. To best illustrate this type of Rebecca-Eureka operations, a typical problem will be enacted.
OSS has informed us that the enemy objective is located somewhere in this area. Although we have flown repeatedly over this section, we cannot spot the target. Consequently, arrangements have been made to drop the parachutist with a Eureka set into this area, where he will be met by his agent partner, make his setup, and home our bomber in.
Eureka, snugly packed in a well-padded zipper case, weighs about 35 pounds. It is snapped onto the parachute harness where it will not interfere with his jump nor subsequent landing. This ground agent located the enemy target and sent the necessary intelligence data to his base, including where the Eureka operator should drop in. The agent times his jump for a spot landing. These jumps are usually made from the lowest possible altitude to avoid detection and to make spot landings. The receptionist runs out to lend a hand, and they quickly clear the gear off the field. The ground agent, already familiar with the surrounding terrain, orients his partner. Until the Eureka is set up, he will serve as guide and perform the necessary reconnaissance. A point has been reached close to their objective. From a reference table, they can work out the distance factors. The plane's speed will be 250 miles per hour. The altitude, 144 feet. From these known constants, the bomb releasing spot is established at 366 yards. Eureka's location can be even farther from the target, up to 1/2 a mile. Eureka is quickly set up and tested. Care must be taken in the selection of the operating spot to avoid interference from higher land or exceptionally large trees, as this equipment has the usual radar limitations. At an arranged time, the set is turned on and is then ready to be triggered by Rebecca. So activated, it will give the plane an approach beacon. However, until contact is made, no type of signal whatsoever is transmitted. The entire operation is timed so that the plane will approach the target at a prescribed hour. The Rebecca operator and his pilot are a team in themselves. Every step is coordinated, and their success depends on immediate response to each other's orders. A second is a long distance at 250 miles per hour, and there is no room for error. When beacon contact is made, it is registered on Rebecca's oscilloscope. The Rebecca operator acknowledges by signaling back to Eureka, and the land agent then codes the approach azimuth. The pilot is notified and banks off to bear in on the new course. On further instructions from the Rebecca operator, he banks back to the right and lines up by compass on the approach azimuth. The oscilloscope indicates that they are off to right of beacon. The procedure followed as the plane approaches Eureka can best be described by animation. The oscilloscope pattern changes during the approach will be shown in the lower left portion of the screen. When the Rebecca operator thinks they're on course, he tells the pilot to bank in. But when the compass is bearing true azimuth, the indicator shows that the beacon is to their left. The operator talks the pilot farther to port. When the plane squares away, he finds that they have overshot and the beacon is now to their right. They edge back to starboard, but as they line up again, the beacon is now slightly to their left. They ease to port, but a little too far. Next correction puts them right on the button. The Rebecca operator keeps the bearing true by constantly watching his indicator. A mile from the Eureka beacon, the Rebecca operator sends the alert signal. He thus warns of their nearness and identifies the particular Rebecca plane that will fly over in about 17 seconds. The ground-based partner with his finger on the bomb release signal button stands by. This is the most crucial part of the run. The Rebecca operator, checking their course, instructs the pilot of even the minutest changes. He picks up the bomb release and readies himself for action. At the exact predetermined second, the Eureka operator, who at this point is literally a ground-based bombardier, signals for bombs away. And away they go. After 10 hours of practice, Rebecca Eureka teams have proved their ability to drop 50% of the bombs within 50 yards of a hidden target. The Rebecca-equipped plane can either serve as a pathfinder, dropping smoke bombs or flares, or as a flight leader of small formations. This newest phase of Rebecca Eureka operation offers an opportunity for effective teamwork between ground and air. where two agencies can pool their specialized training for pinpoint bombing of hidden enemy targets.
Okay, so that gave you an overview as to how it worked, and I must say I wouldn't have fancied being the guy on the ground, especially when you realised the percentage that didn't actually hit the target. It gives you a real good incentive for getting it right, I think, as one might say. The second one is a completely different type of video, and this is actually I'm not quite sure where he is. It's an amateur guy who's just explaining how they work.
Afternoon, folks, and welcome back to the WTF. And this afternoon we are going to show you an interesting bit of vintage radar equipment. And I have to admit that I'm no way an expert on this type of equipment, but we'll endeavour to show you what we have. So this is the item that we've got. This is a BC 929, which is from the Signal Corps, United States of America, and it's a display unit which was part of the Rebecca Eureka radar system or direction finding system, which was used during the war. And in a nutshell, what this was a system of a very early system of how planes would locate or follow a beacon. And the way this worked, this would be rigged up to a transmitter receiver which was in the aircraft, which was called the Rebecca unit, and the Eureka was a transmitter used on the ground or on a beacon or something like that. And the way it more or less worked was that the plane had a highly directional aerial, and it would essentially follow the signal, and this display unit, which would display more or less like a straight line or a line, an indication, so that if, for instance, the plane was moving away or towards the beacon, then this cathode ray tube display unit would indicate the direction he was going, whether he had to steer a bit to the left or a bit to the right. Anyhow, it's quite a complicated system. I managed to find some information on Google, as always. Google to the rescue, and we'll have a quick look at that, so it might just get you a better idea of how it worked. And then we'll have a look inside this, see some vintage electronics, and then we might even try to fire it up and see what happens. I'm not sure how we're going to be able to test it, because the way this worked was using pulses on about 240 megahertz, and I haven't really got that sort of test equipment to test it. But anyway, we'll give it a go and we'll see what happens. So what I've found here is a manual for the Rebecca transceiver, and you can see here, unfortunately, it is rather on its side. That's just one of the things with these manuals. But this whole setup is actually designated SCR729 Alpha, and you can see this is the display unit, the BC929, and this would be the transceiver or transmitter receiver, and you've got a control box there. So if we just scroll down some of this information, you've got it. There's another view of the transceiver, and this would be emitting a signal, apparently, from what I understand, in sort of 2 to 3 microsecond bursts, around about 240 megahertz or thereabouts, and then that would activate the Eureka transmitter, which would then send out a similar series of pulses but on a slightly different frequency. which were then displayed by this indicator unit, which is the one that we've got. There's not an awful lot else in this pamphlet, except for how to set it up. This picture is quite interesting because this actually shows an aircraft with this directional antenna for the Eureka Rebecca system, and as you can see, it's like a Yagi mounted on the side of the aircraft, and I believe they had one on the other side. So these are very directional antennas. Yagi antennas are very directional, and as the aircraft would sort of move from one direction either side of this transmitting beacon, then that would be displayed on the BC 929, and the pilot could then make adjustments. Anyhow, I think what we need to do is have a look at this and see if we can perhaps take a look inside the unit and possibly fire it up. So I'll just take a closer look at this indicator unit before we take the back off it, and you can see here on the left you've got a whole load of SO259 connectors for the different antennas and receiver input or receiver antennas. So you've got left and right, and you also got an input for the video, which I think comes from the transceiver itself, the transceiver unit, and also for the sync. I think what really surprised me about this is that they were using SO259s back in World War II. I mean, this unit I'm pretty sure is World War II, or certainly, just after. And you've got the CRT tube there, obviously. And there's a number of other adjustments for adjusting the sweep length. Unfortunately, it's not really calibrated in time units. It's just pretty random, 50, 100. I presume that might be milliseconds, possibly. I don't know. And then you've also got some adjustment for the vertical and horizontal centralization. And then also range, intensity, and focus, which is the sort of knobs you would expect to see on a cathode ray display. And that's about it, really. Apart from the power supply input, which you've got 115 volts AC and 24 volts. So I think we can manage those voltages, and we need to have a look inside first, and then we will fire it up. So I've taken the back off this display unit and having a quick look inside. There's some really interesting things in this, actually, but some of them I'm not quite sure exactly how they work. Anyway, the obvious thing here is the cathode ray tube, which is quite a nice little smallish one. And we've got a number of octal valves, typical sort of American World War II style. And if we look down here, we've got 6SN7 double triode, 6G6G, which is an audio output pentode, but they're probably using it in a different role. A 6H6G, I'm not quite sure what that one does. And there's another one there. Actually, 6H6, that's actually a double diode, so that's a double diode, and the 6H6, yeah, so those are all the same, but funny enough, that one's actually a different size, 6H6. GT usually means glass tube, as opposed to a metal valve. And then, I don't know if you can see, we'll see if we can zoom in. This valve here is a 2X2, which is an EHT rectifier, which would be for the HT supply for the cathode ray tube. And then we've got another 6X5 GT down there, which is a HT rectifier. I think the most interesting thing is, though, I'll just move this into screen, is this rather unusual thing here. I mean, you can tell this is World War II by these coax connectors. I mean, these are similar to the ones that you get on a 19 set. So it's really sort of old school coaxial connectors. And this thing here, I really have no idea what that does. I am cheating a bit because I have actually fired this thing up and this makes a noise. So it's some sort of motor, but exactly how it works I don't know. That's obviously the transformer there, which runs off 115 volts, 400 hertz. So it's a 400 hertz transformer. So I think what we'll do is we'll have a quick look underneath and see what... There's not an awful lot underneath here to see. It's just sort of standard old school construction techniques. There we go. Try and get it into the picture. So it's very neatly laid out. You know, lots of tag strips with components, and that's that funny metal thing, which is, I think, it's got some sort of motor in it. Nice chunky transformer there, which is obviously for the EHT, for the cathode ray tube. Yeah, so not an awful lot here, but it's, you know, it's in pretty good condition. So I think what we must do is put it all back together and see if we can fire it up. Right, folks, we got this thing set up on the workbench, and I can tell you it's making a right old din. So I got my 400 hertz, 115 volt static inverter there on the left, and we've got the radar unit all working. We've got our 26 volts coming in, and our 115 volts, 400 hertz, and most of the whirring noise seems to be coming from this unit here, which I've absolutely no idea how that works and what it's supposed to do. But anyhow, we do have quite a nice lot of valves here which are illuminating, and the CRT itself, well, it does seem to be doing something. I haven't got any way of testing this because I think the antenna inputs, which you can see there, I think are supposed to be pulse 200 megahertz signals, which I have no idea how to mimic. Anyway, I can just show you. I mean, we can play around with the vertical centralization, which seems to work, and the horizontal shift, X shift. Again, that seems to work. And the focus sort of works as well. But apart from that, I've got no other way of really testing this unit. But it is quite an interesting curiosity. I thought I would dim the light slightly so you can see some of these lovely valves glowing. I'm not sure how well they'll come out on the camera. You can see the screen there as well. Well, it does work. Not sure what I'm going to do with it. So that is the Rebecca Eureka radar display unit. And I hope you guys enjoyed that. Until we meet again.
Okay, so after his period at 140 Squadron, Joe joined 41 Operational Training Unit, and this was actually training people for reconnaissance, specifically in the Mustang. This was recognising the type of war that was about to happen in Normandy, and it was recognising very specifically that tactical reconnaissance was going to be absolutely essential, but that not only would they be going out on reconnaissance, which Joe and all the previous reconnaissance people were used to, what reconnaissance people did not do was to go onto the attack. the general idea of reconnaissance was that the gold, the really important stuff, was the photographs and what was in your head when you're gone over and what you'd seen. So this is why all reconnaissance aircraft were really, really fast. If there was a new development in a Merlin engine, the very first aircraft that got them were the reconnaissance. And that was because, generally speaking, they were unarmed. So they're unarmed and you just got the hell out of there. Part of the reason for that is that the weight and the camera locations, possibly in the wings, took up where there would have been guns. By the time you get to the Mustang, then actually they were heavily armed with cannon. They were not something you'd want to argue with. So its prime function was for Mustangs, and they would have learnt how to attack just about anything. The idea was that they'd attack anything behind the beachhead. And this was Joe's first real direct combat training. Until then, he'd only been trained for either bombing or the stuff that you've seen previously. They practiced reconnaissance techniques for mapping and photographing specific targets. And they had two sorts of ways of doing this. They had vertical photography, and it was, you took a picture, you got up to generally about 25,000 feet. This is called mosaics for making maps. You got up to about 25,000 feet, and then you actually pressed a button. You wanted an overlap, but you sort of had a little gauge on the side of the camera, and it was a remote to the camera, and it said, I'm flying at 25,000 feet at 180 miles per hour. You then held that course, and the little calculator inside would then take photograph, exactly the right time. So as you're trying to look around and make sure you're not about to be shot out the sky, you didn't have to worry about any of that. But for looking at specific targets, radar installations and all that good stuff you'd have seen about Peenemünde, you know, when they're discussing Peenemünde on the films, and how can you tell the height of it and what have you. That was taken using obliques, and the obliques were, so there we go, taken side shot out, and that they did it effectively to get 3D. So you see these ladies, especially the photo interpreters, looking through these 3D glasses. So that gave absolutely a staggering degree of information. Even the shadows, they had, the photo intelligence people were so good that they had tables for all longitudes, latitudes across Europe at various times of day to say what the ratio was of the sun, of your shadow to actuality. And they had that for everything. So if they couldn't see the actual height of something, but they could gauge the size of a shadow because it was going from one side of a car to the other, then you knew exactly how high things were. Okay, I'm going to read something. I'll do a summary of this because I'm just wary of time. So this was there was a second Tactical Air Force history written, and it's talking about the people who do this. The pilots who were selected for this had to have excellent rating, both as a pilot and as a navigator, had to display a high degree of situational awareness. The degree of planning required for an operational sortie was high. They had to know the entry and exit routes. They had to plan their own flight paths, ram the enemy defences, knowing what altitudes to fly to avoid any low-level risk, the weather conditions over the route, and especially over the target, the best angle to fly into the target to get the proper photography, aircraft ground speeds, fuel consumption, all that had to be learned and remembered. They had to, if it was bad weather for the early morning, late evening, they had to know exactly where they were going to be. They had to work out any landmarks that they could find on the way if visibility became poor. And a pilot's planning for a sortie was time consuming and a life critical activity. Now what these guys did was they flew in pairs. You get used to the fighters flying in threes and obviously bombers flying in large formations. Reconnaissance, you only flew in pairs. The number one, he was the guy who was responsible for all that planning to make sure they ended up in the right place. There wasn't sort of like a department in the squadron who worked it out for you. That was your job. If you're the number one, that's your job to work all that out. And it was your job also to take the photograph. It was the number two's job flying literally wingtip to wingtip to make sure that you're protected. He'd be the guy making extra sure up in the air and that you weren't going to be bounced by aircraft, and also trying his best to make sure he saw any risk coming from the ground in terms of flak or whatever, or if there was flak, where's it coming from, how can we get out the way the fastest. Unfortunately, if anything happened to the number one, taking those photographs, it was the number two who would then go in and take photographs himself. He was also had all the camera equipment, and now it was even more dangerous because by the time he came round, and it might only be 20 seconds later, then they were ready for you. So that was what you did not want to be doing. So he did all his training, then he moved to 268 Squadron. This was again part of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, and this is where Joe flew Mustangs. The Americans had supplied Mustangs because they were happy to supply Mustangs. By now, you can imagine the whole of the might of American industry was behind it. And they were helping to, 268 Squadron was supporting Canadians and Polish. And also the Mustangs were being used within the RAF for the long-range bombing exercises that the Americans were flying in their super fortresses over to Germany. So the Yanks were more than happy to send Mustangs over. The problem was that the Mustangs were in massively high demand to support the Americans' own bombing crews going over to Germany, and so they tried to pull them back out of the reconnaissance. And a little bit after D-Day, they tried to put Typhoons in instead. Most people know Typhoons from D-Day, absolutely lethal aircraft, but they vibrated a lot, and so they deployed some into the squadron. Joe learnt to fly Typhoons, they all could do. Everyone on the squadron could fly any of the squadron aircraft, so he was trained on Typhoons and on the Mustang. Typhoon was an absolute beast, phenomenally fast, but vibrated like hell, but it could do a phenomenal speed coming down. That's why they were so lethal. They're very nose heavy. Once you got in a dive, it was quite easy to get up to 550 miles per hour in them, which is going some, probably the fastest thing on the planet, literally at the time. Flying an elite company. So the squadron was full of people with DFCs. These were not your normal mortals. These were guys who had been selected from all over the RAF to fly the most dangerous missions, and you had to have an amazing ability to be a navigator. You had to be able to get over there on your own. Unlike the fighters that we deal with at Bentley Priory, where we were vectored on, somebody would call them up and say, you need to, such and such a squadron, move 35 degrees, your enemy's over there. These guys had to find everything on their own, absolutely everything, do everything themselves. Much of their activity and preparation for D-Day, there was actually a specialist unit set up which only looked at the beaches. That's all it did. It was a multidisciplinary bunch, and all they were caring about from the cliff to low tide and beyond, how deep it was, what kind of sand. They had guys in the special boat service landing on the beaches in X-craft, like these mini submarines. Get out with your kiddies, bucket and spade, take a bit of sand, get back into your X-boat. They wanted to know, is it soft sand? Is it like the grit sand that can support armoured vehicles? Is it the type of thing that can support tanks? What are you up against? So that was one part, but their part in this game was looking at the tidal range. So they would have flown over the beaches, and remembering not just the Normandy beaches, but 4 for 1. So they had to take loads of photographs in places and take all the risk for places that would never be invaded. They didn't themselves know where the invasion was going to come. That was only the real top echelon. But they had to go, and so they did a huge swathe of the coast, not just immediately nearby. This picture is taken near Zeebrugge. They would have taken this at low tide to see what's sticking up. They would have taken it at high tide. So this is what you're actually going to see, and don't fool yourself into thinking this is clear, because underneath there's all these, and these do not stick out the water at high tide. That's what they wanted to know. They then went out to sea, right the way along the coast. They would have taken photographs at about 2 miles out. They would have taken photographs about 1 mile out, and they would have taken photographs looking inwards almost 200 or 300 yards out. Why did they do that? They did that because those photograph sets were divvied up. So if you're in your landing craft and you're going to Juno Beach, and you know that you've got 20 landing craft that they want to go along here, you want to be lining up more or less opposite that church, or more or less opposite that clump of trees at the top. You didn't just diddle-doddle out at random. You wanted a distant photo so that the guy, when they released you from the major ships, so as they were coming in, they knew roughly where to be landing, a bit closer, and then when you got really close, you needed that immediate photograph. Am I in the right place? No, I'm not, but at least I can't land up there because there's loads of landing craft that have been destroyed. I can land here and tell the guys they need to go down there. All that was done from these sets of photographs which Joe took. All the time, the number one priority from Eisenhower was the location of the V1 rocket sites. The V1 rockets, which had only just sort of like started to come over, were seen as the dominant risk on D-Day. The reason for that is the spread. If you look at the flotilla that came over, 7,000 odd ships, you don't have to be very accurate. If you'd have just got lobbed, 500 V1 rockets into that lot, it would have absolutely decimated it. The invasion would have been destroyed before it got to the beaches. So the big thing was to hunt for the V1 rocket sites. This went on throughout the days leading up to D-Day. Anytime you were out over enemy territory, whilst you were going to your target, you didn't deviate going to your target if you were taking reconnaissance photographs, but you would always keep your eye out for anything that you saw on the way and go and destroy it if you were able to. Luckily, the Germans were German, as one might say, without wanting to sound diplomatically incorrect these days. And so they built every single bloody V1 rocket site exactly the same, literally to the meter, and nowadays we call it pattern recognition. Some of the reconnaissance guys absolutely get their eye in. They could see it better than other people, and they were then put to the task. They would recognise this weird pattern quicker. The most distinctive thing, if I can never find my little doodah, was these like little hockey stick things, and there was some reason to do with blast, and thank God that the Germans made them that shape. It was in case there was a fire down one end, or it was some kind of protection for the guys. So that just made them just that little bit easier to find. Number one target. This is not what you didn't want to have to do. Nobody will be able to see these very clearly. This is an actual photo. This is an actual 268 squadron photo of one of these V1 sites. You can virtually not see it, but there's a couple of bits here. There's an installation there, and the ramp itself, you can see where the rocket goes off. So it's dragged out of here, comes along here, stuck on there, and then it's going to go blasting off towards the young lady who's sitting on the bench there. So some poor sod then had to go over and see if it had been destroyed. That was the worst job, because by now there are God knows how many Germans waiting for you. They knew that every time they did this, somebody would be back in a day or so to take the photographs to see if it had been destroyed. That was regarded as literally the most dangerous job in reconnaissance. So we are now D-Day minus 70, so we're a couple of months short of D-Day. Joe and his mates go up to do some naval spotting for D-Day. Bang, splash. So they went up to Gales, which is in Scotland. It's on the west coast of Scotland, one of the almost look like the fjordy bits, if you know what I mean. And what they were doing was on D-Day, and to jump forward a little bit, one of Joe's squadron's jobs, and Joe in particular, one of 6 guys, his job on D-Day at dawn was supporting HMS Belfast. And what they were doing is Belfast would have been sitting 13 miles back from the coast. 13 miles is important because that means you're down behind the horizon, okay? They did later, once they knew that the Germans knew they were there, if you see what I mean, they very bravely, some of these ships moved right close and really gave the German positions a pasting. But at the beginning, they obviously had to be all secret, and so secret squirrel. So as D-Day started, 13 miles out, and Joe and his fellow pilots had to learn all the language of gunnery. It's not like those of you who remember Bernie the Bolt. You don't just say, oh, right a bit, stop, up a bit, stop. You had to be able to talk the exact same language as the gunnery officers. And in fact, on D-Day, Joe was literally in direct communication with the main gunnery officer on HMS Belfast. No intermediaries. He had the code, whatever you call it, to dial straight into him, and they were talking literally one-to-one, as Joe would have gone over. Bang, splash. Why bang, splash? Because at 13 miles out, it took, sorry, I've got to just check this, 30 seconds for the shell to go from Belfast to the beach at Gales, as it would have been. And so you had to compensate for that time gap as a shell came over. So there's no sense in being over the target because you're flying at maybe 180 miles an hour. You're not in a helicopter. So you couldn't be over the target at the time that the gun fired, because if you're flying at like 180 miles an hour, you'll be a mile and a half down the road by the time the shell lands, right? So then you're going to say, oh, where'd that go? So it was really, really complicated. That's why they had to go and do all the training. Group Captain Donkin dunked in the drink. D-Day minus 54. Group Captain, so that was senior guy. Above you had the squadron, then the wing, then the group. So this is a senior guy. But even the senior guys in the RAF were still flying with their men just to understand exactly what was going on. Now, Group Captain Donkin, who was responsible for the group that 268 was in, and one of his fellow pilots, as I say, they flew in twos, they were both hit by severe flak as they were flying over the coast near Holland. He had to land on water, he had to ditch onto the water. His number two, what would normally have happened then is that the aircraft had IFF button, which is international friend or foe, yeah? So normally, as you approach the coast, you would have pressed that little button and some lady in the radar would have told everyone, oh, that's a friendly approaching into coast. What they used to do as well is if they were in trouble, they would press that, I don't know what, 3 times or something. They go boop, 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 leave a little gap, boop, boop, boop. Some lady in the radar station would say, there's something really important, something's gone wrong, somebody's sending me an emergency distress signal, and they would have worked out exactly where that was. Because both their radio, well, one had ditched and the other guy's radio was screwed, they couldn't do that. So they took ages. Normally you'd have just gone over, had a look for him. They had the whole group. They had Albemarles, they had Spitfires, they had everything flying, trying to find him for 4 days in the channel. He'd ditched and Normal had seen him getting into his dinghy, so he knew he was still alive. And it must have been a bit odd. They must have thought, why the hell, here's Joe, by the way, why the hell are we hunting this much for this guy? And it only came out after D-Day. He was one of only 4 people who understood the whole plan of D-Day for the RAF. And he'd gone off just off the coast of German-occupied Holland. He knew everything because he had been talking to the guys about the whole plan for reconnaissance. So he knew the whole plan. Anyway, when he got back, he said, right, everyone's going to go and do their dinghy training. They went to Thamesis, which is still in existence, and they went and trained there. Bonds a day out, as it was described. The squadron, we always say Britain stood alone during the war. But this is just before D-Day. 7 Canadians, 2 Aussies, 2 New Zealanders, 3 from Trinidad, Austrian, 1 Indian, 2 Poles, and 10 from the United Kingdom. So it was a very mixed squadron, and that was typical. Because there were things like, you sometimes see Royal Canadian Air Force Squadron, everyone thinks that they were divvied up, but they weren't. They were really mixed groups. Exercise freedom. This was a beauty. This could have been scripted by Croft and Lloyd. Hello, hello, is this Red Hill? So Montgomery realised that they needed to have some exercise, evade, capture and evade exercises. And so all the pilots were dropped in pairs and told to reach Red Hill Police Station. But two of them, Rashinger and Winslow, they decided that they didn't fancy trying to make their way down to Red Hill Police Station. They were in civvies and what have you, and they were told that you can't ask people. But they could do anything. They could requisition, they could do anything as long as it didn't damage civilian property or injure anyone. So they broke into a Tiger Moth training base, having watched to make sure that one was fully refueled after it had landed. So they broke in and merrily flew one of the Tiger Moths down to Red Hill, which is here. Now, by now, all the local bases have been warned that somebody has nicked one of their aircraft. So as they land at Red Hill, out comes the guard in his jeep, chasing after them, and they come to a halt halfway down the runway, but one of them gets down and the other guy gets down, but just as he's getting down, he leaves the Tiger Moth on tickover. So it's merrily now just bouncing itself just slowly along the runway, heading to the perimeter fence where it will obviously not do itself much good. So the guard who's come out in the Jeep is now faced with two choices. Does he chase after the guys, who by now he knows are RAF guys, so he's not going to shoot him in the back, or does he go into the aircraft? So of course he had to jump onto the aircraft himself, go up and control it. But to add insult to injury, when he got out of his Jeep, these two got in his Jeep and drove to the police station. Which just goes to show like the level of, it shows their character, but also the initiative that these guys had. Fabius and support for the Allied troops landings. They did realise that Eisenhower realised that so many of the troops had not had any experience whatsoever. They had no battle experience. So they set up a lot of really ultra-realistic training exercises, the most famous which is Slapton Sands, where 760 Americans died, whereas only 770 died on Omaha itself. That's a separate story. Joe's squadron were involved with this. Some of them would have done exactly the same as they would have done for the real invasion. They would have been in liaison with the guys on the landing craft to say, what they should be doing, where they should be going, telling them where they needed to be aiming for, where the enemy gun positions were. And then the rest of the squadrons would have been strafing them, pretending that they were strafing them, bombing them, to give them a real idea as to just how bad it was going to be, and to toughen them up to the experiences which were to come. One of the other things that they were involved with prior to D-Day, you would have seen on all the D-Day programmes that were on, there was a massive deception exercise. It was called Operation Fortitude, and this was to try and make the Germans think that the invasion of Normandy was just a feint for the real invasion that was going to come over to Dieppe. They knew from spying and various things, they knew that from listening into their signals that the Germans were expecting Calais, 100%. So they thought, well, we'll just feed along. So Patton was supposed to be in control of this army. You'd have seen with D-Day having just been passed, all these things where they had rubber tanks and they moved them around and all that sort of stuff. That was largely done by the film studio. We had a huge film industry then, Denham and all the Pinewood studios. And so they were the guys who made these dummies. But Joe's job was to fly over, because the German reconnaissance were just as skilled as our reconnaissance were, and look at it and say, is there anything wrong? So they might have flown over and seen these dummy rubber tanks that were moved. They used to move them around. They might say, well, you've moved the bloody rubber tank 2 miles down the road or across the fields to make it look like they're not, you couldn't leave them there all the same place all the time. And they might say, but hang on, if the Germans are going to know it's been heavy rain, where's the tank tracks? They're going to come straight over and know that as, something's wrong. This again, same sort of thing. So here we are looking at, again, 268 Squadron picture of the River Orwell, which is where they had all the support ready to go over to Dieppe, right? Ha ha. So here's our landing ships. This has obviously been put in because probably one day somebody said, hang on, you've got those, but where's the water supply? The Germans are going to realise where's the water, where's the fuel supplies coming into the ships that are down here. Anyway, would anybody care to guess? This looks pretty realistic, doesn't it? Anyone care to guess what you're looking at? They're oil drums, scaffolding poles and canvas. That's what you're looking at. So that was their job, to go over and see, does it look right? D-Day comes. At exactly 6 o'clock, Joe took off on support of HMS Belfast, as I've discussed. This chap here, he went over wingtip to wingtip. What they would do, they flew literally wingtip to wingtip. And Woodward, who was his number 2, was hit by either by flak or it was friendly. It was either friendly fire, because Joe reported flak coming up from the landing craft as he went over. Some of the landing craft took ships. Some were actually they were people from Bentley Priory. There were people with like radar operators, etc. on, and some of those were anti-aircraft guns because they were expecting the Germans to come and pummel them. Anyway, they opened fire despite all the landing or the D-Day markings. They opened fire on them. So he turned back. But was lost. He's buried at Runnymede, where so many of them are, if they didn't have graves. So again, but for the grace of God, bearing in mind they were flying wingtip to wingtip, split second difference between them as to which one of them would have been hit by the bit of flak. Sorry. Again, one of the photos taken of the landing beaches here. You can see a landing craft that's on its side. It's obviously hit something, or a lot of those hedgehogs that you saw, they had massive great explosives on the end as well. And it looks like that's what's happened here. It's taken the side out, so it's capsized. Here you can see this, so Joe and his mates would have been saying, yeah, but they are getting off the beach. These guys are going off. They would have seen exactly what was going on. Now that information would also have come in. The beach masters, who were the guys responsible for all the beach operations, also had their own radio operators. So the beach masters would also have been feeding back to the central intelligence, to the reconnaissance guys, to say, yes, they're off the beach, this is clear, that's ready to go. All that information, masses of information flowing around on these days. And then looking back beyond where they could see Joe's responsibility. Now at exactly 12 o'clock, and I always thought this was coincidence because Joe went over actually 3 times at the beginning of D-Day. First of all, he was responsible for making sure that Belfast's shells were falling in the right place. 2 bunches had gone over first, and they said for the very first salvo, and then the next salvo, Joe's went over for the 3rd salvo that they fired. So 18 minutes to allow everyone to adjust the guns. And I always thought that it was 12 o'clock that Joe and his mates had decided, everything seems to be okay. The guns are all pointing in the right direction now. So we'll go on to the attack. But it wasn't. As is everything else, this is all pre-planned. Exactly 12 o'clock, they stopped being reconnaissance for the Navy. What they then were doing was going back, and they were getting information from the army to say, so somebody might have said, one of the Polish units might have said, look, we're stuck here, we can't see what the hell it is, but we've got mortar fire coming, massive mortar fire coming from there. Joe's bunch would go over, see if they could see it, and then just take it out with their heavy cannon. Or they would pull down, or they would say, it's too big for my cannon, I'll pull down the Typhoons. The Typhoons, which had masses of, it was, like I say, much more heavily armed, had rockets, etc. They were, between the squadrons, I don't just mean 268 Squadron, between the various squadrons, they were just hanging around over D-Day to be called down. Literally, they called it taxi rank. So you wanted the Typhoons to come down, you just say, I need some into this grid, all pre-arranged or coded up. So the Mustangs picked up most of the reconnaissance work and the Typhoons focused on the attack. Part of that was this vibration issue that I mentioned, but also the Typhoons' range was much less. They had side valve engines which swallow fuel. Anyone who's got a side valve engine car will know that they literally just swallow the fuel. So for the first week of D-Day, it was just frenetic activity, trying to take care of anything that was heading towards the beach and supporting the army in the field. They actually, so now we're 2 months past D-Day. They've been progressing through Normandy, all the problems that we know about. And finally, they decide that the front line has come too far away for them to be able to support from UK. And so they moved over, they relocated to France for a more nomadic lifestyle. They would probably have moved a lot earlier, but the Hitler and Goering had said that the number one priority for all the German Luftwaffe was reconnaissance flights, reconnaissance pilots from the RAF, because they realised the damage they were doing. The Luftwaffe weren't strong enough to do anything about it directly, but they wanted to make sure that those that were responsible for locating the targets were taken out. And so that would explain why other units were in France at about D-Day plus 30. In fact, only 4 days after D-Day, they already had emergency landing strips under the RAF's control in France, which I found was quite staggering. Anyway, out they go. Lovely little place, isn't it? It's called Berny-sur-Mer. Oh, what a lovely place to go to. Anyway, it was appalling. It had relentless rain. They were under tented accommodation, which they'd actually been in the UK for about 2 months before they went out there. It had become absolutely sodden with rain. It had become mouldy. And then where they were set up, there was loads of biting insects in the fields. So there was like mozzies and ticks, which aren't what you want. And then they got an outbreak of severe diarrhea, which was latterly described, well, worked out to be dysentery. And this is something you never hear about. If you look at some of the histories, the army and everyone who was going through this area, this particular area, they were all going down with dysentery big time. But the army's demands didn't stop. Worse was to come in the first week of September, when a massive outbreak of influenza as well. And as anyone knows who's had a really bad attack of diarrhea, the last thing you want as well is to have influenza and start sneezing. So they actually, and this staggered me, they were such bad state, they still had to carry on flying because the demand was there. So even if you had dysentery, you got in your plane and you carried on flying. And one of the guys, probably as a bit joke at first, said, well, if you get some ladies' products, we can shove those down our trousers and carry on flying. And that's what they did. They put women's tampons down the back of their trousers and they carried on flying. And you sometimes look at the records so much and you don't notice something. They always flew in twos. But for about 2 weeks here, guys are flying on their own as well, presumably because there's nobody else to do the job. You can't just turn around to the army and say, oh, you know, we've all got the shits. We're going to have to give up for a couple of weeks. Just hold on all the war for 2 weeks whilst we sort ourselves out. Just had to get on with it. Better times at this beautiful, beautiful place, which was a little bit later. It was a convent. The nuns were still there, but that wasn't why it made it a beautiful place, because they were all round the back and not allowed to go anywhere near them. But one of the guys on his wombles around the place realised that the wine was still all in the cellars, and they have what's still regarded as the best ever 268 Squadron, or the whole group, party that they'd ever had in Christendom was held in that building. So, sorry. How do I go back? one of the worst parts, and I'm sure this is one of the reasons why Joe stopped talking about the war. This is the Falaise Pocket, Battle of Falaise. The German army was about to be cut off. There was a huge pincer movement, and the gap through which they had to go was down to about 4 or 5 miles. The German army got so... They would normally only move at night because you knew that you're going to be picked off if you go round in the day. We had absolute air superiority over Normandy, so they knew that they were going to get picked off. So they had to start to move in the day. And on this one, Garside, who was a guy that Joe flew with a few times as his number 2, there was 800 enemy transport, and here they're trying to get through a bridge. This is a railway line. Here is the bridge underneath the railway. Here are a whacking great column of armoured vehicles. Garside flew over this, and as soon as he flew over it, he saw them all waving white flags because they knew that they were a bit screwed. He radioed back to base and said what he'd seen. He said, they're waving white flags. What do I do? He said, just keep there, stay there, monitor the situation. And within 3 minutes, 2 squadrons of Typhoons came and absolutely annihilated them. The theory being that they'll wave the white flag now and then come off later. So they just took the whole lot out. So literally the very first Typhoon flew 0 feet and chucked a few rockets in there into the bridge, which meant all this lot, they were absolutely nowhere to go. Can't turn around fast enough, can't go, can't escape. So I'm sure that's why Joe, because he was involved in similar, I'm sure that's why he didn't talk about it. So this was the Germans' Dunkirk, really. So their army lost so many vehicles. They lost 500 odd tanks, 15,000 men. So they never really recovered from this operation. And at this stage, Joe and his fellow pilots, literally, you got down, you refueled, you rearmed, you got back in, and it was like, as the Americans would say, a turkey shoot. The impact is seen from the ground. Now this I found on the Imperial War Museum site, and this staggered me. Here's a tank. We are talking late 1944. What do you see? Horses, wagons, wooden wheels. So we always think of the Germans as being a mechanised army, but even at the end of 1944, the vast majority of this is horse-drawn transport. And the stench from this was so bad that the guys, once they went below 1,000 feet, had to close their cockpits. Not what you want, really, is it? So, I won't really go into this one very quickly, but I found this was, when I was doing all the research for Joe, apart from the Rebecca Eureka, this was the thing that really shocked me. Absolutely, when you go back on it. So Joe, September the 17th, there was only 4 pilots up, 2 pairs from 268 Squadron. Joe and his number 2, all of a sudden, see up above them, massive great armada of aircraft. Joe couldn't get on the radio to anyone because it was their boat and you didn't get on the radio at all. And if he had done it, he'd given away the position. But what he did do, he abandoned his mission and sortie, and he immediately returned to base. Gets down to base, and he says to his squadron leader, "What the hell's going on? You didn't tell me that I was about to be bowled over by a couple of hundred RAF aircraft." And they said, "We didn't know." So they go up to the group, to wing, and they say, "We didn't know." Go up to group, "We didn't know." So 268 Squadron were completely responsible for the area of reconnaissance around Arnhem and Market Garden. They had definitely, and it is on record, that they had requested, they said that they had lost track of 2 squadrons of Panzers, and they had requested previously permission to take some time out to hunt for them, and were told no. So it just seems very odd that they were never asked to do any reconnaissance at all for Market Garden, and they were the ones who were responsible. The request never came, and at the time and afterwards, this seems to have been completely forbidden topic to discuss. So, 23rd of October, 1944, and the King and Montgomery, who was in charge of all the army, came to say thank you to 268 Squadron and Number 2 Squadron, which was their sister squadron. So the King, it was an official visit by King George VI and Montgomery. So Joe isn't in this picture. You would have known if he's in this picture because he's so short it would have gone along like that and then down and then back on. He would have been in the row behind or round the corner or somewhere. Anyway, he was there. He could remember it. And so he met the King, met Montgomery, and, well, probably just waved, just had his head patted or whatever. But anyway, next day, he went to his MO and said, this dysentery is not clearing up. I've still got terrible stomach pains. And it turned out he had ulcers, stomach ulcers. And without his knowing it, the day before this visit was his last ever operational flight. Because as soon as they realised he had ulcers, you can't fly above 10,000 feet, medical reasons, etc. So he was sent back to the UK. He went to a hospital in the UK for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then he went on as a supernumerary. So he was on training, basically. And then he did actually stay in the RAF until after the war, which was quite unusual. Most people were demobbed instantly. But December, at the end of the war, he was medicaled out because he couldn't fly at all. So, and that was the end of his career. As I said, it was there but for the grace of God. So this is a picture taken just before D-Day of 268 Squadron. Died, missing then died, missing then died, missing then died. He was posted and died. So that just gives you an approximate idea. That's just the back row. There's Joe. As I say, you look along there, then it dips down, there's Joe. So the survivors on the back row, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 survivors. That's it. And when you look at the people he trained with in Canada, in his, this is 268 Squadron, forget that one. Of the 64 men, you remember when he started off in Canada, 64 men who he trained with, 24 of them did not survive the war. So 24 of the 64 did not survive. And so this talk really is in their memory. And thanks for listening.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's fantastic talk. I hope you all enjoyed it. I certainly learned a lot for it. So please show your appreciation to Mark Lemon.
Cheers, thanks. Thank you.